Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's class. We are learning about language learning and teaching. We are currently in Chapter 3 of Foundations for Teaching English Language Learners by Wayne E. Wright. So we are going to talk a lot about the foundations for research and why we teach students the way that we do based on first and second language acquisition theories. And this really gives us the basis of why we do what we do. So let's get started. Our first guiding question: how do students develop proficiency in a new language? So we first have to look at the ways that students learn their first language or their native language. So to ensure that ELLs receive effective language and content instruction, all teachers have to have an understanding of theory and research related to how students develop proficiency in a new language. Modern linguists continue to conduct research and debate exactly how young children acquire their first language and how people acquire or learn a second language or additional language. Each of these theories provides an important insight for our practice. So when we look at first language acquisition, as you all know, newborn babies are born unable to speak, and by the time they are 5 years old, they have a fully developed language system. So two major theories have evolved to explain this achievement. The behaviorist perspective, B.F. Skinner hypothesized that children learn their first language through imitation and positive reinforcement. So the child produces utterances and the parents positively reinforce those utterances to help them correct speech and form meaning. So this prominent view throughout the 40s, 50s, into the 70s was challenged by Noam Chomsky in 1959. So we look at Noam Chomsky, who is widely recognized as one of the world's most influential linguists, is almost the grandfather of the world of learning a language. We learn a lot about him in our teacher education programs. So Chomsky demonstrates that children are able to produce language well beyond what they have been exposed to or what has been imitated. He hypothesizes that children have an innate ability to learn language. And his theory suggests that the presence of a language acquisition device enables children to figure out the underlying rules of language because of their exposure to sample language. He refers to these underlying rules that children know as universal grammar. So once the LAD is activated and children internalize the structure or syntax of their language, they can generate an infinite number of unique grammatically correct utterances. Chomsky's theories were revolutionary at the time, and they led to a rejection of the behaviorist perspective on language acquisition. Although his work remains influential, with most linguists agreeing that children have some form of genetic predisposition for language learning, new research is emerging with linguists and other researchers in academic fields. So some of research that has debated Chomsky's findings. We'll look at Everett first in 2017, who is a linguist who spent 30 years studying the language of a primitive tribe in the Amazon jungle, found that universal grammar could not account for their language, which appears to be unrelated to any other language in the world. Everett argues that language is not innate, but rather a human cultural invention that has evolved since the beginning of our earliest ancestors over 1 million years ago. So language gradually emerged from culture, formed by people who communicated with one another via their brain. So thus language is a handmaiden of culture. Christensen and Chatter in 2017 argued that a more interdisciplinary view of language learning is the science of language, which leads to breakthroughs in our understanding of the origin of language and of first and second language acquisition. These breakthroughs will likely have strong implications for language teaching and learning. So when we look at Chomsky's work, which does focus on first language acquisition, his theories have been highly influential in second language acquisition research and theory. So many researchers argue that we learn a second language much in the same way that we learn our first language, and that second language learners also have access to universal grammar to form internal rules about the language that they are learning based on the input that they receive. So now let's move on and talk about second language acquisition theory. So first, we're going to discuss cognitive theories, and then we'll move to talking about sociocultural perspectives on language learning and teaching. While these various theories present sometimes different or conflicting ideas, knowledge of both perspectives on language learning and teaching gives teachers the foundation they need to form their own understanding and approaches to instructing English learners. So when we look at cognitive approaches to second language acquisition, we're most interested in what's happening inside the brain of a language learner. Because we don't know exactly how people learn their first language, there are many competing theories over how people learn a new language. Research in the field of SLA has led to the development of several plausible theories that have important implications for second language acquisition, teaching, and learning. So cognitivist theories of SLA first emerged as a direct challenge to behaviorism. B.F. Skinner, who you may have studied in a child development class, his theories of learning as a habit of formation through stimulus and response with negative and positive reinforcement greatly influenced second language teaching from 1940s to the 70s. And this focus was mainly on memorization and language drills. By the end of 1970s, following Chomsky's challenge, most SLA researchers had rejected this perspective. So regardless, methods connected with behaviorism can still be found in many language classrooms as well as in curriculum. So let's look at the critical period hypothesis. And this is the understanding or assumption that younger students learn a second language better and faster than older students. So this critical period hypothesis holds that language learning must take place during early childhood if an individual is to attain native-like proficiency and also sounding native-like, so presenting as a native speaker. This hypothesis has supported the popular view that young children have cognitive advantages that enable them to learn language better and faster than adults. And this hypothesis has been called into question by more recent research that's found the ability may last into late teenage years and calls into question whether the advantages are in fact cognitive. Other research has challenged the critical period hypothesis with evidence that adults can and do learn languages successfully and can even attain a native-like proficiency. Research has shown that younger students do have some advantages over adult learners of a second language, but most of these advantages are social rather than cognitive. So think about identity formation and how young students are able to form identities more easily in a second language and culture. Research has also revealed advantages that adults have over younger children, such as knowledge and literacy skills that can transfer from their first language to second language. So now we're going to talk about another extremely important person in the field of language learning, Kreshun. So one of the most influential cognitive models of SLA is known as the monitor model. And this was developed by Kreshun in the 80s. This model includes 5 interrelated hypotheses. So the first is acquisition learning hypothesis. Kreshun argues that there is a fundamental difference between learning a language and acquiring a language. So language acquisition is a subconscious process. We are not aware that it's happening, and we are not even aware that we possess new knowledge that is subconsciously stored in our brains. Language learning is a conscious process. It's something that we do in school or in an educational setting. So when we're learning, we know we're learning, and the learned knowledge is represented consciously in our brains. Learning results in knowing about the language rather than actually knowing the language, which is the ability to use it for authentic communication purposes. Crescent argues that because of the complexity of language, the vast majority is acquired rather than consciously learned. The next part of this model is the natural order hypothesis. Crescent asserts that we acquire the parts of language in predictable order. For example, the ing marker in English, the progressive tense, is acquired fairly early, whereas the third person singular s is acquired much later or may not be acquired at all by older English learners. Because the natural order appears to be immune to teaching, drilling a student on grammatical items before the student is ready will be of little use. The next part is monitor hypothesis. So Crescent notes that although most language is acquired, we can use learned language to monitor and inspect what we acquire and then correct our own errors. Sometimes we make corrections internally before we can actually say or write something. Other times we self-correct after producing a sentence. So the monitor is like a little language teacher inside of our heads, reminding us of the rules. Crescent asserts that the monitor can make a small contribution to accuracy, but acquisition is responsible for fluency and most of our accuracy. The next is input or comprehension hypothesis. This is Crescent's most important hypothesis because it is directly addressing how language acquisition occurs. So in the world of ESL, we talk about this almost on a daily basis. According to this hypothesis, we acquire language when we understand messages or obtain comprehensible input. That is, we acquire language when we understand the things that we hear or read. So Crescent refers to this formula as I plus 1 to explain comprehensible input. And I represents the student's current level of proficiency, and plus 1 represents the input that is just slightly above that level of the student's proficiency. He suggests that we move from I to I plus 1 by understanding input that contains I plus 1. We are able to do this with the help of our previously acquired linguistic competence, as well as extra linguistic knowledge, which includes our knowledge of the world and our knowledge of the situation. In other words, we use context. So context is king when we think about I plus 1. I plus 1 is the key to providing comprehensible input that enables further acquisition to take place. Crescent argues that we acquire language and develop literacy by understanding messages, not by consciously learning about language or memorizing grammar rules and vocabulary. The next is the active filter hypothesis. So Crescent explains that the active filter controls how much comprehensible input gets through to the learner. Even though the student is exposed to input, anxiety, low self-esteem, or a sense that he is not a potential member of this group speaks to the effective filter that will keep it out. So thus, a major goal of language teaching and learning is to lower that effective filter to maximize comprehensible input. This hypothesis has been useful in explaining why individual students make different amounts of progress when presented with the same input. So we always talk about, where is the student's effective filter? Have we presented this in a way that makes students feel comfortable and confident to use the language, or have we put up barriers? Have we made that effective filter higher so the comprehensible input cannot be taken in? Comprehensible input, as Kresham points out, is essential for learning a new language. He summarizes the 5 hypotheses with a single claim. People acquire second languages only if they obtain comprehensible input and if their effective filters are low enough to allow this input to come in. When the filter is down, an appropriate comprehensible input is presented and comprehended, acquisition is inevitable. In fact, it is unavoidable and cannot be prevented. So, although Kresham's hypotheses have been and continue to be highly influential, they've been criticized for their emphasis in acquisition over learning and their application to classroom teaching and learning, which seems to be a lack of direct instruction on grammar and other language forms. Cognitive and developmental psychologists believe that there's no distinction in the brain between learning and acquisition, and therefore general theories of learning are sufficient to account for language learning. Kresham does not acknowledge a role for some direct teaching, but his theories do not necessarily provide guidance about what should be directly taught and what students will naturally acquire on their own. So now let's talk about some different hypotheses. The first is interaction hypothesis. So Long, who developed interaction hypothesis, agrees that comprehension input is needed, but he focuses on how input can be made comprehensible through modified interaction, arguing that learners need opportunities to interact with speakers of that language and reach a mutual comprehension. In modified interaction, particularly interactions between a language learner and a proficient speaker, the speakers make several modifications as they get their meanings across. Some modifications may include simplifying language, reducing the rate of speech, or using gestures. Proficient speakers might repeat or paraphrase what they say and use comprehension checks. The learner may ask for clarification. The proficient speaker also provides corrective feedback, which may take the form of direct correction or indirect correction through more subtle means, such as repeating what the learner said, but recasting it in a correct form. All of these corrections are made within the natural flow of conversation. So here's an example. If the learner says, "I go to doctor yesterday," the proficient speaker might respond, "You went to the doctor yesterday? Why? Are you sick?" So giving reassurance that the meaning came across, but recasting that to correct the form. You went to the doctor? Okay. The next hypothesis, comprehensible output. So Swain brought attention to the importance of output in second language acquisition in the late 80s with her comprehensible output hypothesis. Swain argues that when learners are in conversation, making an effort to produce language that the person with whom they are conversing can understand, they are most likely to see the limits of their second language ability, and they need to find better ways to get their meaning across. Knowing that they have to speak forces them to pay more attention to what they're saying. So Swain and others argue that comprehensible input alone is insufficient, and creating comprehensible output is also needed to facilitate language acquisition. Kresham disagrees with this. He argues that spoken and written output occurs too infrequently to be a major source of language development. The next is input processing model. So Van Petten developed the input processing model, which looks at how learners make sense of input and how they get linguistic data from it. Van Petten argues that communicative input is the essential external ingredient for language acquisition. He defines input as the language learners, what they hear or see in communicative context, or language that is embedded in a communicative event that the learner attends for its meaning. He stresses that to be successful, learners have access to input and interaction with other speakers of the second language they're learning. He also addresses how newly processed input leads to changes in the learner's developing linguistic system. This system change involves two sub-processes. The first is accommodation, describing the process by which learners actually incorporate a grammatical form or structure into a mental picture of the language they are creating. The second is restructuring, describing the process by which the incorporation of a form or structure makes things change without learners ever knowing. Finally, Van Petten addresses output processing to explain how learners are able to make use of their acquired implicit knowledge in conversation with others. And lastly, transferring knowledge from first to second language, or L1 to L2. From a cognitive psychological perspective, we may consider how students draw on what they know in their first language, their L1, and how they are learning a second language, their L2. Students are able to take much of the content area knowledge and literacy skills they gained in their L1 and transfer them to their L2, as we've been discussing. Students who have developed substantial content area knowledge through their L1 do not need to relearn the same concepts in English in their L2. ELLs who have more advanced skills in math, for example, do not need to relearn concepts in English. They just need to learn the language that's necessary to demonstrate what they already know in a new language. Although linguists and language educators recognize that much of what transfers from one language to another is beneficial, which is positive transfer, in some instances, transfer from L1 may cause interference or negative transfer. Students may attempt, for example, to apply their knowledge of syntax in their L1 to English. So, for example, a student who is a native Spanish speaker may say house of friend rather than friend's house. Effective teachers recognize and value the vast storage of knowledge that students have in their first language and provide instruction that enables students to draw on this knowledge. This is called teaching for transfer. All right, so when we move on in the timeline, we start to see sociocultural perspectives on language learning and teaching. And these stand in contrast to cognitive psychological approaches because the focus is not on what happens inside the brain of the learner, but rather the sociocultural context surrounding the learner that facilitates the learning process. So sociocultural perspectives have been growing in popularity because they help teachers consider and address linguistic and cultural diversity in their students, the languages and literacies that their students use at home and the community, and the languages and literacies needed for success in learning English and academic content at school and beyond. For sociolinguists, the term home language is preferred because it highlights the language or languages students use in the home to communicate with family members and others in the community. So when we look at sociolinguistic research, it began in the late 60s in an effort to understand the relationship between languages and the societies in which they're used. Though the research was not focused on language teaching and learning in general, the findings of these studies help teachers make informed decisions in addressing the needs of English learners. For example, Heim's notion of communicative competence provides the basis for communicative language teaching, or CLT, and content-based instruction, CBI, which we'll be talking about, both approaches. Research of non-standard varieties of language has shown that linguistic varieties are typically rule-governed and logical systems, such as Spanglish, the mixture of English and Spanish. Yet they're often stigmatized unfairly by speakers of dominant standardized varieties of language, which leads to inequities for speakers of these varieties within a school setting. Sociolinguistic research also helps teachers understand the dynamics of their relationships between English and other languages spoken by ELLs, their families and communities, and the implications for structuring language and content area instruction programs that best suit students' needs and interests. So we learn first from Vygotsky. Activity theory stems from the work of Vygotsky. He was a Russian psychologist who studied child development in the 20s and 30s. Again, if you've had a child development class, you've most definitely studied Vygotsky. His influence on language learning and teaching began gaining momentum in the 1990s. According to Vygotsky, learning is a social activity, and knowledge is constructed through interaction and collaboration with others. Children's learning takes place when they interact and collaborate with adults or other skilled peers. Children's language develops primarily from interactions or conversations within social settings, especially in a supportive and interactive environment. So Vygotsky gives us the zone of proximal development. Again, we talk about this in ESL almost on a daily basis, the ZPD. This is a domain where children can reach a higher level of knowledge and performance with the support of an adult or another knowledgeable person. This assistance with ZPD is called scaffolding, which evokes a construction metaphor, of course, and it's where scaffolding is temporarily used to build something and removed once the building is completed. So when we talk about scaffolds in the world of learning, we give students the supports that they need to reach that new level. And then once they're there, we remove the scaffold. So we're not providing a crutch. Researchers and educators apply the concepts of ZPD and scaffolding to the process of language learning and teaching. So let's talk about the zone of proximal development versus I+1 from Crescent. Teachers often incorrectly view Vygotsky's ZPD as essentially the same principle as I+1 in Crescent's input hypothesis. Although it is tempting to view them as the same, since both appear to be addressing the issue of providing something just above the learner's current level of proficiency, the two concepts depend on very different ideas about how language development occurs. So Crescent's theory reflects a cognitive perspective and focuses on the acquisition of a second language and the provision of comprehensible input that contains forms and structures that are just beyond the student's current level and just beyond what he is or she is ready to acquire. Vygotsky's theory is about knowledge development in general, with emphasis on how learners co-construct knowledge based on their interactions with others in a given sociocultural context. So I+1 draws on input hypothesis, a teacher's intention of what the students will acquire about past tense forms naturally. So let's do an example. A teacher will facilitate multiple opportunities for students to receive comprehensible input by hearing speech or reading that contains examples of correct past tense use. In a ZPD example, a teacher may plan for more deliberate and meaningful interactions of past tense forms, working with students to co-construct their knowledge and understanding of the past tense. So a teacher and students might co-construct a text through shared writing and talk about a field trip, providing opportunities for the students to use correct forms of past tense and guide their use as they write the text together. Teachers might create a word chart using past tense forms that they need in their writing. The writing activity might be followed by students working in pairs to talk about the field trip in preparation for writing their stories. The teacher can monitor students' use of past tense in speaking and writing and provide assistance as needed, such as referring them back to the charts or adding new words that are heard in conversation. These activities will take place within the student's zone of proximal development, and the teacher provides scaffolds necessary for students to understand and use the past tense forms correctly. So you can see in the example of ZPD how interactive and social the learning is. So our next guiding question is, how can different theories of language learning inform effective practice? Sociocultural theory gives us a greater emphasis to the role of speaking and collaborating and learning a new language, and has opened the way for researchers to focus on collaboration and interaction as a key to language learning. Vygotsky's ideas have also widely been embraced by educators who appreciate the important role given to teachers and to classroom interaction in sociocultural theory. Teachers are elevated from mere facilitators of comprehensible input to knowledgeable, skilled experts who interact and collaborate with students and who carefully plan and scaffold instruction within the zone of proximal development to co-construct knowledge with their students. So now let's talk about bilingual and multilingual pluralist perspectives. It's important to distinguish between bilingual education programs, which use two languages for instructional purposes, and a bilingual perspective, which can be embraced by teachers who work with bilingual learners in any type of instructional program, including ones in which English is the only use for instruction. It's also important to recognize that not all bilingual programs embrace a holistic, dynamic, and bilingual perspective. Teachers who look at language learning and teaching from a monolingual perspective may feel reluctant to allow students to use any of their home language in the classroom. Bilingual teachers who look at bilingual education from a fragmented or compartmentalized perspective may insist on strict separation of languages, depending on the time or subjects that have been designated for instruction in one language or the other, and may discourage children from translanguaging. This monolingual, compartmentalized perspective has been dominant in US schools for many decades. In contrast, teachers who look at language teaching and learning from a dynamic bilingual perspective see translanguaging as an integral part of the natural ways bilinguals use language in their everyday lives. Bilingual education programs that reflect a holistic bilingual perspective bring the two languages together in intentional and strategic ways. Teachers may preview a lesson in the home language and then teach it in English, or allow students to discuss in their home language a story that they read in English. Teachers might use bilingual books or encourage students to write in their own language. While socioculturally oriented teachers recognize translanguaging as a powerful way to help students transfer knowledge from their home language to English, they do not view it as a one-way process or a means to an end. Instead, they recognize that positive transfer can also go from English to the home language, and that conversations and activities involving all of the students' languages can be effective in maximizing students' comprehension of rigorous academic content. Our next guiding question is, how do you develop your own personal approach to providing effective language and content instruction for English language learners? So approaches and methods used in teaching a second language have evolved over time and been influenced by both traditional cognitive theories of SLA and sociocultural perspectives on language teaching and learning. So we use both truly in practice. The term approaches refers to an overarching philosophy of second language instruction, and we'll be viewing some approaches. And methods refers to a set of procedures for delivering second language instruction. We'll also be looking at methods. In reviewing curricular materials or visiting the classroom of effective teachers of English learners, you will most likely see a mixture of approaches and methods in use. So we will go back to the 1840s to just briefly touch on the grammar translation method. And this was used from the 1840s to the 1940s. And it's largely based on the way Latin was traditionally taught. So students were required to analyze and memorize rules of grammar and then translate sentences between the two languages. This approach is not based on any theory and has no advocates, but it continues to be widely used among teachers with little training or experience in teaching language. When opposition to grammar translation developed and language educators and researchers began to ask why methods for teaching language were being used, which, as we all know, is no longer a spoken language, we started to see new methods developed. The next that we see being used in the late 30s to early 40s is the audiolingual method. And this grew out of a need for foreign language proficiency in the US after World War II. After the US entered World War II. So the audiolingual method was highly influenced by behaviorism, which was the dominant view of second language learning at the time. Language learning is viewed in the audiolingual method as habit formation. So there's dialogue memorization and drills focused on particular language structures. This method fell out of favor in the 70s following Chomsky's challenge to behaviorist theories of language teaching and learning. While audiolingualism is no longer a dominant method, it remains in a lot of curriculum, textbook dialogues and drills, language labs, and we even see it now in commercial language learning in programs, computer software, and apps. The natural approach was popularized in the 80s and applies Kreshren's 5 hypotheses to the communicative language learning classroom. So in contrast to audiolingualism, which focused on grammar, the natural approach emphasizes the use of comprehensible input in the classroom so students can acquire language and structures naturally as it's used for meaningful communication. So the teacher's job is to provide comprehensible input in a safe space, in an enjoyable classroom. This environment helps to lower the affective filter and maximize comprehensible input. The teacher uses a wide variety of techniques, such as total physical response. So as I say the word higher, I'm showing the students higher, higher, higher. This involves the teacher typically physically reacting, also using real objects such as realia. So if I'm teaching about bananas, I have a real banana. Small group work, and any other activities that involve meaning communication. This helps to facilitate comprehensible input. Kreshen and Terrell also outline 5 stages of language acquisition: pre-production, early production, speech emergence, intermediate, and advanced. Using these stages, teachers can identify appropriate activities and expectations for students. Because students acquire vocabulary and grammar naturally, there is little need for direct instruction and practice through the use of memorized dialogues or drills. Communicative language teaching, or CLT, emerged in the 80s and remains the approach favored by most experienced language teachers and researchers. CLT grew out of dissatisfaction of the audiolingual method, which really just produced students who could memorize dialogue, but had very little ability to communicate with speakers in the target language. So the focus of CLT is on language learning to actually use it in communication and with other speakers. So CLT is not a singular teaching method, but it is a set of core applied principles, which are: learners learn a language through using it to communicate. Authentic and meaningful communication should be the goal of classroom activities. Fluency is an important dimension of communication. Communication involves the integration of different language skills. Learning is a process of creative construction and involves trial and error. CLT's emphasis on authentic, meaningful communication and learning as creative instruction makes it highly compatible with the sociocultural perspective. And in CLT, there is an emphasis on providing grammar instruction, which they call a focus on form, which is input-oriented and meaning-based. So now we're going to talk about content-based instruction, or CBI. And this is an approach to second language teaching in which content area subjects are used as the basis of English language instruction. So the content areas, math, science, and social studies, provides a meaningful context for authentic communication as learners collaborate and compete carefully designed academic tasks. CBI is a specific form of CLT that focuses on teaching students to successfully communicate about the content area. So the model suggests training content area teachers to help English learners learn the content area while supporting their English language development simultaneously. This type of instruction is called sheltered instruction. You will hear this in the world of ESL. CBI can now be thought of as a cover term or a blanket term for a continuum of approaches that integrate content and language instruction. On one end is content area instruction by ESL teachers who focus on language development. On the other end is sheltered instruction provided by content area teachers who are trained to make complex content area concepts comprehensible for ELLs at different proficiency levels. Bilingual ESL and content area teachers with ELLs in their classes receive training in sheltered instruction. The Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol, or SIOP model, was developed in the 90s and remains a popular model for instruction of English learners in K-12. This approach is consistent with the goal of most K-12 ELL programs, which is to prepare students for mainstream content area classrooms. Whole language is a philosophy of literacy instruction that emphasizes teaching reading strategies and skills within the meaningful context of whole stories, poems, and other texts. So you see this top-down approach to your right. We start with the whole idea with English learners. So we give them a book, a video, a photograph to really help them to understand the concept. And then we break it down in parts of language. So we start at story, we break down to sentences, then we look at words. From there, we look at letters and sounds. So this is the opposite of the way a native English speaker comes to kindergarten. They always start with the alphabet, right? Letters and sounds, moving to reading words, sentences, and then stories. So although the term whole language is now used infrequently because it is politically controversial over the ways that we teach phonics, the strategies and practices associated with whole language are still in common use. So there's an ongoing debate always of whole language versus phonics, or the science of reading. So, we have to know that as ESL teachers, English learners do benefit from whole language. Let's talk about multiple intelligences, which you may have learned about in other courses, as well as cooperative learning. So Gardner coined this term multiple intelligences, and it's a theory that asserts that intelligence is multidimensional. Classroom instruction should be maximized to really meet the needs of learners according to a particular set of intelligences that a student might have. So these intelligences may include linguistic, logical or mathematical, spatial, musical, kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, or naturalistic intelligences. Teachers have found that multiple intelligence approaches to help them identify and teach students strengths in both language and content area instruction. Cooperative learning focuses on the use of small groups within which students can collaborate to solve problems and complete academic tasks. Cooperative learning appeals to language teachers because it offers rich opportunities for students to engage in meaningful conversation and obtain comprehensible input as they interact to complete academic tasks. Freire developed critical pedagogy in the 60s. He is a Brazilian man who was looking for ways to offer education to populations in Brazil to transform students' lives and the society in which they live. So many educators in the field of language have recognized the importance of critical pedagogy in helping ELLs understand and confront unequal power relations as they attain English proficiency and learn academic content. Critical pedagogy is often a key component of sociocultural approaches to teaching and learning. Freire developed a process that encourages students to confront the social issues that contribute to their oppression in a dominant society. It involves problem posing, reflective thinking, knowledge gathering, and collaborative decision-making. Critical pedagogy requires teachers to take risks by opening themselves to new ways of perceiving the world, including thinking about ways to transform power relations that exist within and outside of school. Freire's concepts are central to levels 3, transformative, and 4, social action of Banks's levels of multicultural education. So looking beyond approaches and methods, current knowledge is always changing, and no one method or approach is applicable to every language classroom. So just going through these approaches and methods for myself, as a teacher, I use all of them. The context of the classroom and needs of the students should be the starting point rather than any given method. So teachers can use the following questions to guide their decisions about what strategies to use to promote English learners' content learning through English, their English language development, and their cultural integration into the classroom and school community. What are the students' strengths and needs? What are the instructional goals? What is likely to be challenging about the goals for these students? What strategies can help address these challenges? And how will you know whether these strategies are effective? When teachers know their English learners' language, literacy, content, and cultural strengths and needs, they can compare them to the students' language, literacy, content, and culture instructional goals. Teachers can then determine what is likely to be challenging about a particular activity, lesson, or unit for those students, and select appropriate instructional and assessment strategies. Richards and Rogers suggest that teachers try out different methods and approaches. In doing so, they should be flexible and creative, drawing on their own beliefs, values, principles, and experiences to adapt the methods and approaches they use to the realities of the classroom. They refer to this process as the development of a personal approach to teaching and a set of core principles to draw on when teaching. They offer the following examples. Engage all learners in the lesson. Make learners the focus of the lesson. Provide maximum opportunities for student participation. Be tolerant of learners' mistakes. Develop learners' confidence. Respond to learners' difficulties and build on them. Use a maximum amount of student-to-student activities. Promote cooperation among learners and address learners' needs and interests. So thank you so much for your engagement today. In Class 6, we will be discussing language and education policy. Remember, please contact me whenever you would like to discuss your reading, writing, thinking, or any other matter. Thank you so much, and I hope that you're enjoying your day.